Okay, we are reading chapter 10 of The Game of Silence. We're moving into a new season, winter, or what's the word for winter? Baboon. Okay, chapter 10, Old Tallow's Coat. Dede always said that the winter could not truly begin until Old Tallow donned her coat. Hers was a coat of strange magnificence, a patchwork of destroyed fabrics and new furs. Each year, Old Tallow added something new to the coat so that it never diminished, only increased in complexity. There were lynx and marten furs, velvets, parts of blankets, rabbit, bear, and otter scraps, as well as trade wool. There were even other coats contained within the coat, as if it had swallowed them up. Old Tallow reworked her coat every fall to keep the stitching tight. She added inside pockets or loops of belt for her knives, a holster for her hatchet, a hood one year, an extra collar. One cold, blustery afternoon, as Omakias hurried back from a trip to Auntie Muskrat's, where she had been visiting Twilight, she saw Old Tallow bundling through the woods. She was wearing the coat. It was a thrilling sight. The furs and patterns billowed around her, and her dogs loped beside her in chase of some invisible prey. They passed quickly over the frozen earth and were gone. Omakias kept walking, the sight fresh in her mind. Sure enough, by the time she was in sight of the cabin, the sky went a frigid white and the air filled with flakes of snow. The snow fell deep that night and did not melt in the morning. Winter had definitely arrived. The long winter nights were for storytelling, and Nokomis was known as an excellent storyteller. To request an adizukan, or story, someone gave her a small amount of tobacco, just enough for her to smoke in her pipe. Nokomis took the tobacco, and sometimes she smoked her little pipe as she thought about the story she would tell. When the wind howled outside and Omakias was safe in her rabbit skin blanket, curled tight against Nokomis, there was nothing better than to hear Nokomis begin a story. She told the holy stories and the funny stories, the Aduzukanag that explained how the world came into being, how it continued to be made. These stories explained how people came about and how humans learned so much from the wise and hilarious teacher, Nanabuju. This last being, who did so many absurd and yet meaningful things, was a favorite of Omakias. Another favorite story, though it chilled her and sent Pitch crawling for Mama's lap, was that of the terrible monster of the ice and snow, the Windigo. When Nokomis told a Windigo tale, her voice deepened and even the wind outside quieted down to listen. Her eyes grew narrow and a cold breath sighed through the cabin walls. Omakias pulled her blanket close around her, shivered deliciously, and listened. The little girl and the Windigo. This happened in the old days, said Nokomis, when some people had great powers and the animals spoke to us. In those days there was a little girl whose mother died. Her people were unkind and they did not take care of her. She was considered the smallest one and made of the poorest stuff. She never got the fat meat, only the bones from the bottom of the pot of soup. She never got the warm spot next to the fire, but shivered beyond its circle. Nor was she given good clothing to wear, but made do with the tattered ends of skins and worn-out furs that other people threw away. Yet because her moccasin were full of holes, someone took pity on her. Some spirit looked her way, and was moved to watch out for her. One of the old men began to say that a Windigo must be about. The kettles were moving on the fire, wind came from nowhere, the flames died, and yet the water boiled. An owl was caught within a rabbit snare. Now, for sure, the old man said, let us make ready. A Windigo is coming near. Here's how we will do it, the old man told the people that night. We will all come around the fire and we will all try to smoke this pipe. Anyone who can get it to light without a match will be the one with the strength to fight the Windigo. The warriors tried first. One and then the next took the old man's pipe and worked on it, breathing on it and begging it to light all by itself. But nothing happened. Each of the old men tried next and found that they too were useless. The women tried, both the old women and the young. No matter how they talked to the pipe and blew into it, still nothing. At last the children tried, even the babies. There was no success. Then the old man said that there was one person too humble to try the pipe. This person was sitting at the edge of the fire where she always sat, and she was wearing the raggediest clothing. She didn't even own a blanket. She was that poor. The people turned around. At first, they were so used to overlooking the girl that they saw no one. Then all of a sudden, they noticed her, and some of them laughed. Some of them said it was no use. Why even bother? They told the old man to forget about it, but he insisted, saying that even the lowliest must try now, or they would all be devoured. So the little girl was brought near the fire, though she was shy and so afraid that she could not look at anyone who helped her. Feeling the warmth of the flames for the first time, she thought how nice it felt. Her heart grew stronger. She was able to take the pipe in her hands, but only when a woman felt sorry for the girl and put her own blanket around her shoulders did the girl dare to put the pipe to her lips. The first time she breathed on the pipe, nothing happened. Some people shook their heads in disgust and went away. The second time she breathed on the pipe, it remained cold. More people left, and others said there was no hope. The third time the girl tried to light the pipe without a match, nothing happened again, and she almost put the pipe down from shame. But then the spirit who was looking after her spoke so that only she could hear. "Think of your mother," said the spirit, and the girl thought of her mother. She touched the pipe, and it caught on fire. Now she knew exactly what she needed to do. She suddenly became very powerful. First, she called the old man's dogs to her. They came and sat directly at her feet. Then she instructed the men to find her 2 stout rods of sumac. They should cut them and bring to her at once. The women, she said, must use the fire she had started to boil a great kettle full of tallow and not be afraid of her when she started to grow. Soon it became very cold. Everything began to crack. They could hear the trees bursting in the woods, even the rocks. The people saw the Windigo stride across the lake, which froze beneath his feet. He was made all of ice, a huge man-shaped thing white as frost. He came on land, and wherever he stood, ice took over. The cold got worse. It filled the girl too, and she started to grow. She grew into a giant, and then she faced the Windigo. First, she sent the old man's dogs to kill the Windigo's dog. They did so easily. Then she took the rods made out of sumac in her hands. When she did this, they turned to copper. With the first rod, she knocked down the Windigo and held him. It was a terrible, raging battle, but finally with the other rod, she killed him. Then she drank a cup of the tallow soup from the kettle on the fire. Instantly, she came down to her own size again. The dogs became regular dogs when she let them lick some tallow from her hands. She then opened the mouth of the dead Windigo, which was full of jagged teeth made of ice. Into this creature she poured the rest of the boiling hot tallow. The ice melted off the Windigo entirely, and when it did, a normal man was left lying by the fire. This man was never told he had been a Windigo, but he was watched very carefully. He was told that he must hunt for the little girl. So she had everything she wanted from then on. "Now," said the spirit who protected her, "you must always help these people. Even though they scorned you, they will now respect you. You must show them how to become more human." Eventually, the little girl married and was happy. She had 4 children, and when she was old, she told this story. And when the people heard it, they all agreed it was important to be kind to the ones most helpless, the poor, the old, the children. You never know whom the spirits have chosen to help you, and even to save you. The smallest and poorest looking person might have enough power to kill a Windigo. Mi'i Minik. While he listened to Nokomis's Adijukan, Dede always worked to fashion something with his hands. He made 3 kinds of snowshoes: the curved snowshoe, the little round bear paw snowshoe, and the snowshoe with a tail. He used the split-soaked basswood he had collected in the summer and moose guts for the lacings, as fresh as possible. He sewed tight webs of sinew between the sides of the snowshoe hoops. Dede made drums, too, for use during ceremonies. He made another special drum, which he planned to give Fishtail when he returned. He carved a pipe in the shape of the claw of an eagle holding an egg. He carved a pipe stem that twisted in a beautiful whirl. He made lacrosse sticks, fishing decoys, a doll cradle board for Omakias, a toy rattle for Bijins. He made snow snakes, carving them with beautiful designs. These snow snakes were the favorites of Pinch. Every afternoon, Pinch took his snow snakes and went out to the edge of the lake with the other boys in Two Strike. There, they took turns seeing who could throw the snake the farthest across the ice. They conducted endless snow snake contests and wars. First one, and then the other was champion of the snow snakes. When they tired of that game, they went sliding farther down the shore where the land sloped excitedly to the lake. If they got going fast enough on a piece of elm or birch bark, they'd slide far onto the ice. Of course, that made this into a contest too. The one who slid furthest was declared chief, or Ogechida. Two Strike coveted the title, but more often it was the angry one who threw himself farther on the ice. You guys see that picture? Looks like fun. Omakias often went sliding with her cousins, and sometimes, if the snow was soft, they had long snowball wars that lasted into afternoons, broke off at dusk, resumed the next morning, and went on for days. One day, when the snow was just right, Omakias ran to Auntie Muskrat's to fetch her cousins. The angry one was there, hauling water up from the inlet where the family kept a great hole open in the ice. Today, he wore the same forbidding look that Omakias was familiar with on the face of old Tallow. For some reason, maybe because the day was so bright and the world so cheerful, the angry frown made Omakias laugh. "What's so funny?" growled the boy. "You never smile." "Don't feel like it," he grumped. "I want to beat Pinch at snow snakes today, not haul water." "Go on then," said Omakias, feeling kindly toward him, maybe because he was so absurdly mad. "I'll haul the next few loads of water." "You will?" The angry one looked completely astounded at her offer. He stood rooted to the icy ground, so surprised that he was almost upset. Omakias took the brass trade pail from his hands, dumped the water in the big kettle, or akik, steaming on the outside fire. Then, without another word, she went down to the inlet where the hole was chopped in the ice, leaving the angry one still mystified. Omakias laughed to herself as she filled the pails. He probably wonders why anyone would do anything to help such a sour person, she thought, and he's right. It's worth it just to see the surprise on his face. That night, the winter snow snake games and sliding turned into the biggest snowball battle ever conducted. Of course, Two Strike was the leader of the boys, and Pinch was her top warrior. Omakias was the leader of the girls, and Twilight and Little Bee fought fiercely at her side. But the boys, including some cousins from the village, outnumbered them. They were being driven from their territory farther and farther into the woods. Two Strike's snowballs were hard, often carrying rocks. Once she hit Omakias full in the face. Omakias was stunned. The smack of the snowball and the pain of the rock were awful. She was too proud to cry. Little Bee got hit next, and she did start to cry. Suddenly, with a blood-curdling shriek, the angry one leapt into the battle on their side. His arms moved so fast they blurred. He packed snowballs hard, too, and always hit whoever he aimed for. He got Two Strike right on the nose, and she was so surprised that she plopped down right on her seat. From the snowy ground, she peered up at him, wiping the snow off her face. "Hombe, my warriors, let's fight to the death," she yelled, leaping to her feet. But Pinch had already started to laugh at his snowball fight chief, and once a warrior laughs, there is no going forward with the fight. To the disappointment of Two Strike, everyone was suddenly friends. For the rest of the day, they constructed a dog sled and tried to train Makataiwazi and Twilight's dog to pull it. But the two always bounded off after Wabazug or pulled in opposite directions. They were hopeless. The children finally headed back to their homes, to the warm stew pot and the snug fur robes, to the fragrant cedar of their sleeping corners. Only as Omakias approached her cabin did her thoughts turn, as they always did after a few hours of distraction, to worry over the fate of the men who went to the 4 directions and those who were on the journey to the west. No word had come from them yet. Well, let's keep reading. Learning the tracks. What do you think the tracks are?
Train tracks?
Nope. And they're not animal tracks either. Every morning now, Angeline and Omakias set out for school. Once they arrived at the schoolhouse, they shook the snow off their makazinan and slipped into their places in the schoolroom. A cast iron stove at the back of the room threw so much heat that they preferred to sit up front. It was easier there to study the marks that the teacher made on the big black piece of slate and to copy them onto their own smaller slates. They saw the break-apart girl every day now, and they could even say her name, Clarissa, though it still sounded like Gisina. She passed out the slates every morning and began the lesson by writing out the alphabet on the main blackboard. The small slate that the girls used had to be returned before they left, as well as the pieces of chalk that made the fascinating marks. All morning, Angeline and Omakias practiced letters and numbers. In the afternoon, they went home. As they walked back to the cabin, the air around Omakias' head seemed written with swirling figures and patterns. She had tried so hard to make sense of all the teacher said that she couldn't shake the marks out of her head. Soon she knew all the letters and the sounds of the letters, and she could say them along with Angeline. At night sometimes they practiced the letters by tracing them in the frost that formed on the inside of the cabin walls. They taught Dede the letters, and he took their teaching very seriously. Every night he practiced writing the letters that composed his name, Mikwam. When he could write out the entire alphabet, he asked his daughters the sounds of the letters. He learned the sounds of the letters along with them, and they practiced so much that Yellow Kettle grew annoyed and said, "Stop those strange noises. Let's have a story. Anything to drown you out." Setting snares. So what were the marks, or what were the tracks? The letters.
They have tracks?
They call the letters tracks because just like you read tracks, animal tracks, you can read the letters and sound out the words. Setting snares. The winter day began with a strange blast of sunlight, then dripping water and an odd, surprising warmth. Everyone walked outdoors, hardly bothering to grab their blankets or winter leg wraps. The sudden visit of summer, a blue sky, and snow melting in the trees sent people out to fish and hunt. Old Tallow took her dogs and ventured to the wildest part of the island, hoping to bring down a deer. Dede and Pinch went out to the inlet to chop fishing holes in the ice. As for Omakias, she went out with her grandmother to set snares in places where the rabbits ran. Wearing their round bear-paw snowshoes, they tramped through the brush in the pleasant warmth of the midwinter sun. Just past the place where their garden sprouted in summer, there was a clearing where lightning had struck a stand of big trees, bringing some to earth and burning others. Here Nokomis sought many of her medicines. It was also a place with heavy new growth of tender bark trees and lots of cover for rabbits. Omakias looked carefully at the ground, reading the long oval tracks of the Wabujug. Am I saying that correctly?
What?
Wabujug. They took certain paths through the undergrowth. As she followed the path of the Wabujug, is that right, Dante? Good enough? Wabuzug. Omakias had to see the rabbit itself in her mind's eye. That was the trick to catching it. She had to imagine just where it would jump, just where it would nibble, just where it would stop. It was the jumping that was most important when it came to setting the snare. Omakias bent a pliable branch over to the earth and attached it to a noose made of sinew. If the rabbit jumped exactly where she thought it would, the loop of sinew would catch it and the branch would snap up, holding the rabbit out of the reach of foxes. As she carefully set each loop, Omakias frowned in concentration. This was delicate work. Nokomis was very good at it. For every snare that Omakias managed to set, Nokomis set 5 or 6 of them. And then often she would go back over Omakias' work and make tiny adjustments. As they worked, Omakias noticed that her fingers, which had not even needed mitts on the way out, were getting numb with cold. Sighing, she took the mitts she'd stashed in her waistband and shoved her hands deep into the warmth. So much for that teasing taste of summer. Next, she noticed that her feet were freezing, even in her fur-lined winter makazinan. She stamped her feet and moved quickly. The cold was sharper now and penetrating. Nokomis' eyes were flashing in this cold. She loved being outside, whatever the weather, picking medicines or setting snares. "That's all the summer we'll get," she cried. It was very cold now. "Let's start for home." They almost didn't make it. The snow had melted on top, but now froze so quickly that there was a tough crust of ice on top of every drift. When they left the shelter of the fallen brush and tried to walk along the shore, they slipped and slid. They tried walking the way they'd come, through brush. The snow was still slippery on top, but somewhat better. But the cold was becoming deadly. Their breath, which had shone in the air as steam, now froze instantly to the sides of their blanket hoods. Bits of ice came down on their brows. Nokomis said, "We can't stop moving." Her voice was harsh as a raven's call of alarm. Omakias jolted awake. She felt sleepy, and she knew that was dangerous. They had worked up a sweat setting so many snares. The cold had fallen so suddenly that, should they stop, their sweat could freeze on their bodies and draw all of their inner warmth. A sudden drop of cold like this could kill them. "Watch your step!" Nokomis' voice was even louder and boomed in Omakias' ears. She knew that her grandmother saw that she was getting clumsy. It was the cold. She couldn't feel the ends of her toes, then her whole toes. Her feet burned, and then she couldn't feel them either. "Keep walking!" Nokomis shook her, and Omakias knew that it was a shake of desperation meant to save her. She couldn't speak, though. Her mouth was sealed by the drowsiness, her tongue was cold, the ice drops hung heavy on her eyelids. Plus, it was so much trouble to talk. Omakias longed to lie down in the snow and sleep. One part of her mind knew that was certain death. She could not consider it. The other part of her mind could not help dwelling on how pleasant it would be. "Omakias!" She had fallen. Nokomis pulled her up and shook her harder now. Omakias came awake and smiled at her grandmother. "I'm coming," she said obediently. On numb legs, she stepped and stepped. One foot moved, then the other. She kept track of them. They amused her down at the ends of her body. Her feet moved in and out of her line of vision. She almost laughed, but the laugh froze inside of her. Sleeping was the only possibility. "I'll just sleep for a minute," she heard herself telling Nokomis. The next thing she knew, she was being jounced along on her grandmother's back. The old woman staggered beneath Omakias and had trouble moving at all, for their combined weight drove her snowshoes down below the crust of ice. When the crust broke, Nokomis wallowed in the snow. Several times she had to put Omakias down and hoist her up again. At last, just as she wondered if she could do it again, Nokomis saw Dede picking his way toward them. He'd gotten worried about them and followed their tracks into the woods. Once he got to them, he grabbed Omakias, and then he and Nokomis tramped as quickly as they could back to the cabin. Okay, we're going to pause right there and pick it up tomorrow.